All right. Hello. I'm here today with Bad Mouse, and we're going to be talking about anarchism, communism, and potentially Antifa. I think there's a lot of questions about these things going around, a lot since recent events have overtaken me, especially in my hometown. So, how about you introduce yourself, Bad Mouse, and then we can start with some questions. Maybe even take some from the chat.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Bad Mouse. I've been an anarchist and a communist for a good 2 years now. I make videos on YouTube that many have noticed as of late with people like Sagan Ricard. And yeah, I suppose that's me. I also think that Christians should be fed with lard and that white men, including myself, should die. So, yeah.
Well, we'll get to the implementation beliefs later, but can you explain that? Does that mean you're a Marxist? You say you're an anarchist. So maybe you can explain some of the distinctions inside there.
Well, anarchism and Marxism both sort of got popular in the early 1800s. And of course, among there was people like Marx and Engels. They were sort of the two most popular Marxists. There were others as well, obviously. Then you had people like, for example, Proudhon, Malatesta, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, Kropotkin, people like that. And they were sort of on the anarchist spectrum. And basically, largely, I suppose in the past, it was vastly different. Mainly today, the only difference really between Marxism and anarchism is how people interpret how you would take down how you would, I guess, implement communism.
Does it still follow the same sort of dialectic materialism thing? Like,
well,
in perspective of history?
I don't know really, because I'm I do, and I think any good anarchist should, any good communist, socialist of any variety should understand both sides, and I have over recent years understood both sides of the argument, and so I do. I don't know. I need to sort of debate with more people about this, but I do somewhat agree with the sort of the dialectic of Marx, I suppose. Do I think that necessarily he was right in his predictions 100%? I don't know particularly, but I do agree with a lot of what Marx's theory has said.
What in particular? Could you elaborate?
Oh,
yeah, like
well,
the core theorems that you consider to be essential.
Well, I suppose the theories that he had on alienation, on the theories he had on the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, just the basic theories of him, and yeah. So I agree with also. I don't necessarily agree, but I have a more understanding of sort of the, I guess, Marxist-Leninist position, I suppose. Rather than some who just seek to deny it, I'm welcome to understanding, the other spectrums of the Marxist variants of socialism. So yeah.
Okay, so the anarchism you have is specifically within the Marxist framework, where we imagine sort of class warfare as dominating history and controlling historical forces, and sort of the bourgeoisie as being the stopgap to stop actual change from coming about due to a revolt of the working class against the owner class.
Effectively, I suppose, yes, yeah. But no, I do advocate anarchism in the sense of what do you call it, opposition to illegitimate hierarchies. That's sort of the main basis of what it stems from. Therefore, it then stems from that you would eliminate things like the.
Well, that's interesting because most people would oppose what they see as illegitimate hierarchies, right? I think illegitimate would sort of be synonymous with wanting to oppose them, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. But then the problem is that when, so for example, some people might say that they oppose illegitimate hierarchies, but then a lot of them would not really necessarily disagree with something like the police. They just want to reform certain parts of it rather than changing the whole structure of it as a whole.
I think they would. I think the disagreement would be whether the police are an illegitimate form of authority. That's the question, not whether you would oppose the police if they were illegitimate.
Yeah, but well, most of the time we do consider them illegitimate. And what I was saying was basically that a lot of the time people will seek to sort of reform these structures, like reform capitalism, reform the state, reform police oppression, all that kind of things, and then it would go away. The problem is that we've been doing it for so long, and yet nothing has seemed to come from it. And what that leads me to believe from there, and what led many people to believe it from there, is that it, in a sense, cannot, and that we need to destroy the structure that holds it true, because people respond to the structure they're in at the end of the day.
Nothing can. You mean there's been no improvements, or the improvements haven't been as large as you would like?
Well, there have been improvements over time.
Okay,
but there have also been problems that have occurred since then. So,
as we would expect, I imagine.
Well, yes, because again, the system reacts to the spaces you're in. So yeah, it would.
So the idea is that to get a bigger, more radical improvement, you'd want to tear down the system rather than. I mean, I guess this is sort of Marxist in some sense. They believe that there would be a gradual worsening until there was just a break, and then the whole thing collapsed in on itself. Saying in some sense that there are improvements, but we need to take a more radical leap, and that involves actually destroying the systems as they stand.
Well, the improvements really only came about because people realized there were problems, and they sought to sort of get on top of that a bit. Like, for example, in America, there was massive. Well, it's not just America, everywhere, but America is something I know a little bit more about, I suppose. In America, there was massive inequality of the classes. There was massive destruction of workers, their unions, all that kind of thing. And so what happened is they tried to organize, they tried to push back against it. And that is what
history is. This the early 20th century, or is this
yeah, sort of around that time period. And things were very bad back then, but the only reason they improved was because there was a ton of dissent, and so they needed to make certain reforms in order to as well as because people were being.
That seems to be like the case for reform, though, isn't it?
Well, yes, but the problem is we have been reforming for some time, and the problem is that whilst there have been some good things, like, for example, we have an 8-hour work week in this country. We didn't used to have that, and I'm not sure what it's like in America, but in this country, we have an 8-hour work week. In France, they have a 35-hour work week. Now, those things have been accomplished because they didn't just were granted. People fought for those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. But there were reforms, certainly. You agree, right?
There were reforms, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, insofar as we've seen progress in the movement, they've been a series of reforms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there hasn't been a destruction of the social apparatus of America between the early 20th century and today.
No, not particularly, no.
And then there were in other countries during the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, I think that this is obviously what communism has to contend with, was that if you measure from the time period you picked, which was the early 20th century, and the time period that we currently occupy at the beginning of the 21st century, many countries did reform, and many countries had violent revolutions. The countries that performed reforming actions are significantly better off in the current time frame than are the ones that had violent revolutions, and suffered much, much fewer catastrophes in that 100-year period.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be sort of a problem, wouldn't it, for the...
You've got a bit of static in your audio, just let you know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try to take it off here.
That's still staticky.
Well, can I hear?
Yeah,
can you hear me
it's good. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Okay, so what I was going to say is that I apologize for the microphone, everyone in the chat. You've picked early 20th century as sort of a starting point, at which we agree that there were reforms put in place for things like labor, things like social welfare, potentially, that have occurred in the last 100 years. But in that same 100-year period, there are a variety of countries that, instead of accomplishing changes through reform, instead accomplished change through massive upheaval revolutions. Now, it seems that if you take those instances and compare the two of them, the countries that underwent the change through reform are much better off and had much, much less death in them than the countries that experienced the violent upheavals and revolutions, especially those violent upheavals and revolutions driven by the communist idea.
Okay, so in terms of, let's say, they're better off in a sense in one aspect, but I don't think it's as simple as just saying, well, the reforming countries are better. At the same time that there were reforms, there were also problems. For example, the Ronald Reagan Thatcher years brought in massive neoliberalism, destroyed worker unions, disseminated loads of families, and that was brought upon by the state, by the capitalist interests, in order to get rid of the
there is
they're better off in some ways. Like, for example,
they're better off in the ways that we haven't had 20 million people die of starvation, in a 5-year period.
Well, I thought now we've had like 100
hasn't
million
happened
starved in a 5-year period. Yeah, no, it hasn't happened in America, but it has happened in other countries that have used the capitalist system. So, for example, I just had this chart a second ago and I just lost it and I just saw it. Okay, 8 million people die every year because they lack clean water.
Yes, and the population of 6 billion people.
Yeah, and
this is throughout communist and capitalist countries. But that's worldwide.
No. In the past 5 years, 100 million people have been killed from lack of clean water, hunger, vaccine-preventable diseases, and malaria.
Sure. Yes, I agree. There are problems.
Yeah.
But the thing is we're talking about problems, and we're asking what solves them the best. I guess right now we're on a very practical question, so maybe I'll just keep on answering basic questions. But let's say I grant that revolution is the way to solve the problem. I am a huge critic of modern culture and modern governments, but I imagine that my ideal situation and your ideal situation would have a lot of differences between each other. What kind of society do you imagine a revolution bringing about, and how?
What society would I imagine a revolution bringing about? Well, I firstly imagine that a lot of the control would be run democratically by the workers, for one. And I would advocate removaling of the capitalist system. That's what the main intentions would become.
What does that entail, I suppose?
So, well, it requires a very militarized, not necessarily militarized, but radicalized working class. People who have to work to earn their means of survival. That would have to come, and there would also, basically need to be a society.
Class, or would this also be the bourgeoisie?
Well, it would be the main chunk would be that of the working class, because we're the most numerable and we're the people who are without any means of private property, any means to the means of production. I am working class. Yeah, I get paid just above minimum wage. I live in a fairly deprived area. I think I'm working class. Yeah, I have to work I have to work to sustain my life. Yes, by working for someone else who exploits my labor. Yes.
That doesn't necessarily not make you bourgeoisie, though.
Why?
Institutions of society are bourgeoisie.
Why?
Because the bourgeoisie is the educated middle class. If you're middle class or not working class.
I do as well
makes
say
that
that
incredibly clear.
I do state that yes, I am middle class, but in terms of how I have to work for my
Wouldn't that make you a bourgeoisie, though?
Well, I don't own any of the means of production, though.
But bourgeoisie
And
is
I have to.
the bourgeoisie is the middle class. It's not the owners.
Hmm?
The bourgeoisie is the middle class.
The bourgeoisie or the capitalist class are the ones who
No, it's
own the
not.
means of production.
No, that's
No?
wrong. That's incorrect. No, the
That's always being called
Okay, well, let's
production.
Google it here,
What it takes to produce goods.
Merriam-Webster's dictionary translation: bourgeoisie, the middle class, typically with reference perceived to materialistic values and conventional attitudes of the society at the time.
Okay. Well, here's another one. The capitalist class, also called the bourgeoisie, the means of productions are what it takes to produce goods, raw materials, machining, ships, workers. Workers own nothing but their ability to sell their labor for a wage.
Are there multiple definitions?
There is a sea of debate within there, okay? But in terms of me, okay, having to earn my way through society by working for a wage, then yes, I would consider myself to be working class. But I would also fairly admit, okay, at the same time, that I'm to extent middle class because I've been to university and I'm fairly educated. But then the reality is,
to most people, that would make you middle class, because if you look at communist revolutions like Pol Pot, he would like shoot people for being in university for being middle class, for being bourgeoisie.
He would also take funds from the Americans, but what I would say,
we're not talking about who took funds from. I'm not friends of the American government. I'm saying that how he defined bourgeoisie was very distinctively middle class. But anyway, that's not fine. Yeah. We're not part of the owners. I think we both agree with that, right?
Well, do you own like a shop, say, or do you own a factory or anything like that?
No.
No, then I would consider you to an extent, by the socialist definition, to be working class. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of people who don't fall into that category also don't belong to workers' unions. The labor is not interchangeable. So in the Marxist sense, the union would be very difficult to establish and control and stuff like that too.
And I'm not saying that working class means you're part of a union.
Okay, but so when you say a militant working class, what do you envision, I suppose?
Well, the working class needs to have class consciousness, it needs to have class confidence and class competence. It needs to understand the reasons for why they are without, a lot of the time, the fact that they don't have access to their means of production. They don't have access to what defines their lives. They only have the access to vote for a pre-selected candidate every 4 years, or ethically consume, or something like that. And those are indirect actions that don't change the course of our lives, and that the best you'll get from that is some kind of reform. Now, the best way to do that is to an extent, dismantle the institutions that create those problems, and then rebuild them in the way that would not, encounter those things.
Well, do you have an example of how you'd rebuild, say, I worked in a factory, I've worked in a factory as an engineer for about 3 years. So I'm very intimately understanding about how factories are put together and how they're run in a modern context. I'm trained as an engineer in that context. Do you have an example of how you would put together these institutions that would allow people more control, I guess?
Well, yeah, well, like a factory. Yeah, well, it's very simple. So, say you have modern day.
As someone who's worked in a factory for 3 years, almost nothing in a factory is simple.
Okay, microphone's going a bit. I'll talk over. Right. So, so for example, a factory, and then you're making shoes, something like that. Okay. You got one guy or whoever, group of small people at the top. All right. They're the people in charge. They own the building, etc., like that. Below that, you have all of those people who are producing these goods, producing those shoes, ka-chunk, 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 down the factory line, producing all these goods, okay? Now, now, if you were to, for example, that they are the people, first and foremost, who are producing, all right? If $1 million worth of profit goes out of that factory each day, okay, basically all of it is produced by the workers. If they stop working, nothing is produced. All right, that's
yeah, nothing is also produced if the factory isn't coordinated or if the markets aren't there for the goods.
Yeah, and that can be done without necessarily having a boss who sits there at the top and dictates how you will go about your working life. Okay.
By boss, do you mean manager?
By boss or manager, yeah. So
by
you know, well,
I mean, it seems like we're using a very 19th century
the person who owns the factory has control over it, has rights to it, and has it protected by the police. Let's say that, yeah. Okay.
So
now, take something like a cooperative
owner of the factory, right? Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And to a lesser extent, I suppose those who also, you know, sort of, what do you call them, like managers who are, I suppose, yeah, for example, if you had like
I intimately know how factory management is set up. There's at least three layers of managers.
Right. Okay. So
there's the three levels of managers, and then you have a vice president typically. You've got project managers, group managers, area managers, vice president. The vice president will pretty much executively oversee the factory, and he'll report to a president typically. I mean, this changes from company to company, but we're talking about a diverse range of skills and ways to spend the time when we talk about the managerial class. But I'll keep on going. I'm bogging this down with details. Okay. So you're saying that if we just co-op the whole thing.
Well, yeah. Well, not yes. Okay, because cooperatives can function very, very well without necessarily having to have that boss structure at the top.
Yes.
If you look at something like, if you look, exactly, direct democracy, critical consensus, that can work fairly
I've
well.
never seen a modern manufacturing system run by direct democracy.
Mondragon.
Yeah, there's some smaller instances of that. I'm talking about modern high scale, though. It's very difficult.
Yeah, and I've actually done a video on this on my channel about why cooperatives don't work. And what I was detailing that is that within the system we have right now, it's very difficult for cooperatives to actually get up there in the world, because you have people who have
I have a question though here. So both owner and also executive. You've kind of used them interchangeably. But in most modern factory systems, the executive who controls, the executive that controls the factory isn't the same as the person who owns it. Oftentimes, the CEO is an employee hired by the owner board and operates almost independently of them, and frequently fights with them over control of the factory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, does he produce labor, I suppose?
Well, that's questionable, I suppose.
Well, look,
what do you count as labor? If he says
the underlying fact, okay, is that if they're not, necessary to the production of labor, then we just say, well, why not just change it so that doesn't have to happen? Okay, it doesn't necessarily need to have these people. That's the reason why there's a common saying, the socialist thing. Your boss needs you. You don't need him. That's the common form. And I don't care whether it's executive manager, CEO, boss, whatever. Okay, the fact of the matter is we don't necessarily need them, but they rely on us to produce their wealth. That's the point.
I'm not so sure that you could fire all the managerial class in a factory and still have it function.
You could still very much so easily reform parts of it so that it would work similarly.
Oh, reform, certainly. I mean, but this is the thing. I think that the question comes down to, can we eliminate some jobs that are fundamentally middleman jobs? Sure. Can we reform labor practices so that they're better? Sure. Can we just take an entire group of leadership, totally decapitate and expect everything to operate? My experience thinks that's incredibly unlikely.
Well, it's unlikely, yes, because they have a ton of power and a disorganized working class left.
No, I mean, this is just a question about what you produce, right? How many, if you're making shoes, right? Like, what kind of shoes is the factory going to produce?
What in a culture end?
What do you mean? I mean, that's the question that needs to be answered, right? Every day, right? Every part of the factory needs to produce so the other parts. I mean, it's not just a factory; it's a whole supply chain, right? uh, the supply chain has to operate so that one person gets up and makes something that somewhere 10 steps down the supply chain needs to take. And this is the problem, is that the factories in one, the workers in one factory aren't going to know what people are necessarily going to need or want or require to do their job. So, and this is kind of like the typical problem that we have. Independent objects, they operate in supply chain. And we need some way of sending that information.
Okay. Well, again, like I've said before in my videos, why the problem we have with the market system that we have today is that there's a heck of a lot of media propaganda. There's a heck of a lot of shit that goes on that makes people want to buy things that we don't necessarily need.
I agree with that.
Trinkets and everlasting Christmas trees. And we don't need them, frankly. And I think, to be perfectly honest, we're getting a bit too muddled up in like how exactly a cooperative will function, rather than looking at the fact that right now, today, we have this enormous problem with people who are using working people to create goods and live off their labor. That's the main point.
Well, so I my channel title is called The Distributist. I'm not really distributist because I think it has a lot of problems that haven't been solved yet. But the distributist point of view would be to essentially try to encourage working class buy-in of company stocks, to make them part of the owner class as much as possible, to try to reform banking, to try to reform redistribution, so that everyone is sort of collectively part of the owner of capital. So the distributist critique of Marxism was that Marxists think there are too many owners, whereas distributists think that there aren't enough owners, that that property is needed to be more widely distributed, and that if we can accomplish a system that will slowly redistribute wealth and bring the locus of control back down towards localities, we can do a lot of good. Now, I fully acknowledge that distributism has a huge amount of implementation problems, but I think on a fundamental ethical scale, that is what we would want. We would want the ownership to be distributed, and we would want the expertise on the managerial level to remain with the people who have the expertise in order to execute on it. That includes market direction, that includes managerial direction, that includes forecasting and optimization.
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, very good. But I mean, it's still not justice. It's still operating in the capitalist system, is it not?
Well, if what you're saying, if we took a factory, we had a society that had a more equal distribution of property.
Even if you, for example, were to give just everybody, let's say, a better share of the of the wealth or whatever, because of the system you're operating in, that people, like one product more than the other, let's say. They like one item more than the other. And eventually that money is going to end up in the hands of smaller and smaller people as time goes on. And that's what's happened today. Now, it's not actually 65 people who earn more than the poorest half. It's now 8 people. And that has continued to grow.
To make reforms to put into place counterbalancing economic things. Like the original distributist idea was to have land redistribution banks that would essentially highly tax land property and then essentially uniformly redistribute it to people who worked on the land. Now, in the present system, this wouldn't be very useful because land doesn't comprise a large amount of the capital we have out there. But the idea is the same. You could easily imagine mechanisms, rules that would essentially make a high cost, wouldn't put a prohibitively high cost, but would essentially tax the cost of doing business, and then use that as a way to constantly flow capital back into people who have, say, lost or been unlucky inside a system where people were competing in a market.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that's a perfectly nice thing to talk about, but the problem is that if you still have those capitalist markets in place, if you still have a very similar system to what you have today, then that's still going to lead to a lot of problems.
I mean, every system will have problems, I guess. I mean,
how do you mitigate
let me just compare this. I think I've painted a very detailed picture of how I think things should operate, essentially keeping in place the managerial and executive classes insofar as they're experts, and then trying to distribute the ownership, which is a separate question. And insofar as we can use taxation and very, very light, uncoercive mechanisms to do that, especially through banking reform, that might be the way to proceed. So that gives you a good picture. Exactly how would you organize a supply chain? I've heard things getting rid of the bosses, but that just sounds like you're going to decapitate your entire range of experts from figuring out how to manage a complex system of production.
Yeah, and I understand that, yes. Now, if you, for example, have someone who is very skilled, let's say, a doctor or somebody who's good at organizing something, then that's great. Be a doctor or an organizer. But the point is, don't take my wealth give me the fruits of my labor, effectively. If I am producing a certain amount, then give me that certain amount. Don't just take off money from there and use it to your own benefits. In other words, for example, in cooperatives, they work out the pay between them. They work out the pay of how much they will get, and they come to an amount that is good for them. Okay.
I mean, I don't know. How does it work? Do they vote on it?
Yeah, they vote on it. Yes, and they do it within also the what do you call it? They do it within the conditions they have as well. So obviously they're not going to just say, well, I think we should all get £10,000 an hour and something like that, obviously, because that's not going to work. But they do it within the conditions that they have available to them. Yeah.
How could that possibly work? Wouldn't you just have a bunch of people voting each themselves more money? Mm-hmm. I mean, how would you even balance it, right? I mean, and who's paying for it? Would it be the person downstream? Would it be society?
I don't know. Look, I'm not the best person to talk about when it comes to how exactly X would function in a society, right? What I am most, talking about right now is the system that we have and how power is functioned and related, and how that leads to problems arising again in the capitalist system.
I totally agree. Yeah. The problems need to be reformed.
Yeah,
I think that the way to do that is to identify the problems, and then the issue is that, so I've heard two propositions. First of all, that radical change is needed. I heard that capitalism sucks. Okay, yeah. It has problems, certainly. Radical change is needed, not gradual change. Then I think we have allusions to sort of a Marxist system. But I have to get to criticism probably before I was really intending to. But the big critique, I'm sure there have been numerous critiques and historical evidence to show that these collective ownership of and management of systems just doesn't work.
Such as?
Well, the von Mises's critique of price setting is devastating.
Is that the economic calculation problem?
Yes.
Okay, you can find innumerable critiques of the economic calculation problem and how it doesn't add up to what people think they are. No, I haven't. Sorry? I can, but I don't actually have the information with me right now. But what I can tell you is that it is not what it seems to be. Okay, and actually, I believe I've actually. What's his face? This is easy. If you're in the chat, please just summarize that, because he should know something about that. Yeah.
Well, I don't really have a source or a summary. It's a little hard to
I believe it only relates to a certain factor of.
There's three problems.
Yeah.
The first one's price setting, which I mentioned, the von Mises argument, which is you can't coordinate in a supply chain without a relative scale of value that also includes an incentive structure. The second one is going to be essentially the freeloader problem. The fact that you are going to have deadbeats that try to exploit the system. And if your system is just open such that lobbying efforts can be replaced for work, people will be more interested in political affiliation than they will be actually in improving their work. And the third one is just is capital accumulation and direction. The idea that you have to concentrate wealth in the hands of people who want to take risks. This has been a major problem in many communist systems, is that the wealth tends to get locked in bureaucracies that don't want to take risk. When all of the growth comes from putting capital into the hands, at least temporarily, of people who are willing to take more risks. So those are the three main economic problems. And they beset co-ops, they beset communes, they've beset communist implementations in China, Russia, all the places that have been communist, and I've never seen answers for them. I guess. So those are the three, and to me they seem almost devastating. Insofar if utopian idea that you'd all vote on what a factory produces would work. Okay, I'll put this. Can I give you an example from my own life? Okay, so I worked in a factory. I'm not going to tell you what factory or where it was. I don't want to dox myself. Okay, so one day and said, we're going to stop producing this line of products and we're going to start producing this other line of projects, and every factory gets to scale 20%. This essentially meant that everyone had to essentially double their workloads because we had to retool all the machines. We had to demo half of the tools in the factory. We had to bring in night crews. When the night crews come in, the engineers are pulling out their hair because all the plans and things that they have set up are just gone, right? Because it's going so fast. So it meant more work for everybody. But this, if this decision was going to be made, it was necessary for the supply chain because the product A that we had been making wasn't in demand. The consumer didn't want it anymore. And the product B that we were going to put into production was highly demanded. And so if this had been voted on, if the transition from A to B had been voted on, no one would have voted for it. It would have been more work, more hassle, and no one wanted to do it. But we needed the risk needed to be taken in order to give the consumer what they wanted.
Okay, so are we talking about societies that happen in the capitalist system today, or are we talking about them in a possible hypothetical future scenario where we have some form of socialism?
Aren't there socialist countries in the modern world?
Yes.
We just look at those. Oops. Oh. Did I lose you? Hello?
Hello?
Okay. Yeah, hey, how's it going? No, I said there are socialist countries in the modern world, right? Couldn't we just look there?
We'll just look there. Yes, and the problem that comes when people talk about socialist countries. So, I don't know, let's just go for the big bang, right? Okay, like the Soviet Union, should I say. Okay. It's not as simple as just looking at, say, the Soviet Union and thinking, it was this big, like billions and billions of people died or whatever like that, because there were massive external problems that were like stopping the full flow of what wanted to happen. So, for example, there was a massive trade embargo by Western Europe and America that prevented a lot of medicine getting through, which caused a lot of people to die.
The people who died in that didn't die of medicine shortages.
They also died because of famine. Yeah.
Yes,
And they also
famine that would have
died.
ordinarily been fed from land that was inside the Soviet Union.
And they also died because they were through a civil war, and they died because they were destroying railroads, and they were destroying means of which to distribute the food across the places. Another thing was because, from what I'm aware, and again, I'm only doing things on what people have told me. Another thing was because there was a lot of landowners who wanted to not have this happen. They didn't want collectivization or anything like that, and so they withheld a lot of their lands and so forth, and they didn't give it back to the people, so to speak. And so, just from there, and what I'm just saying is,
Stalin collectivized the farms, whether the landowners withheld it or not. There weren't any landowners after Stalin collectivized the farms.
Yeah, but they prevented somewhat of that happening, I believe.
How?
I don't know exactly how that happened.
Yeah, I'm mystified. Because there certainly weren't any landowners after the collectivization of farms.
Yeah, but it was a gradual process, was it not?
It was pretty fast.
Okay, fair enough. I'm not too familiar with it. This is just what people told me. Okay, fair enough. What I'm basically saying here is that it's not just as simple as, well, this shit happens. Okay, there was also a bureaucracy that formed. There was also a
it happened in China too. I mean, this thing, like, yes, it happens so frequently that, you know, it's almost predictable, you know.
Okay. Well, there was also a bureaucracy that formed within the Soviet Union. Okay, and there was a bureaucracy formed in the Soviet Union, and also people like Lenin destroyed the workers' councils that allowed them to collect. Lost my words. I don't know. What I'm basically saying is that it is not as simple as people pointed out to be. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I'm sure nothing is ever as simple as people pointed out to be. I guess, I mean, the thing is, it just, when we look at the things like the former communist countries, we're talking about just disasters, and ones that seem to, I mean, take Venezuela for disaster. I mean, once we stop talking about, when we talk about socialism as actual state control of industries, it has an incredibly bad track record. Socialism as a welfare state, that's a little bit, you know, that has a much better track record, and that's a totally different thing. A welfare state is just capitalism with some reforms on it. But at any rate, so I guess, so is the idea that we would have a revolution and set up a communist government in the countries that we would live, and then the government apparatus would institute collectivization, and this time would work better than the Soviet Union? So
I'm not advocating the Soviet Union, man.
What are you advocating? How about?
I don't know. Let's just fuck everyone, shall we?
Well, no, I'm clarify what you would like to see happen. So, like, we have a revolution, and, you know,
I'd like to see the means of production put back into the hands of the workers. That's what I'm advocating.
Okay, so the workers. Okay, so how would this? I mean, I understand that. I mean, in some sense, I agree that people should have more property.
Why should somebody have why should, like, one person be allowed to own a factory that employs 100 workers?
Why should one person be able to? One person typically doesn't. A group of people typically do.
Why should that group of people be able to have the exploitation of 100 workers?
I think the ownership of companies should be more widely distributed. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we should. Pardon me?
So you think that the land should be held more commonly by the workers?
Yeah, yeah. I think that I think the reform is that's needed is some plan in place to make sure that the holding of capital. I mean, it used to be land, but now, frankly, in our present financial system, it's largely finance. Capital has moved from being largely land and production equipment to finance. And I think that needs to be a little bit more widely distributed. That needs to be perhaps a lot more widely distributed. We need to make essentially more capitalists, and you know, every man a capitalist would be a perfect idea, in my opinion.
So everyone should own some part of that factory, I suppose.
Yeah, ideally. I mean, the ideal sense would be that people would own stock in the factory that they worked at. They would own stock in the town that they would be shareholders in the things they participated in. That would be the ideal scenario. I mean, I personally would like to see more of a localization of things, and that's kind of what motivates me. Is I would like to see government more localized. I would like to see. I mean, I'd like to see production more localized, but I'm very much aware of the economies of scale problem. But I mean, that's not neither here nor there. And I like to see control and culture more local too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would definitely make people happier.
It would make people happy, yeah. But what I would fear from there is that you know, property would eventually accumulate within a small number of people.
Right, it tends to. So you'd have to explore mechanisms in reform to dissipate that.
But then why would people who are in a position to not do that prevent that from happening?
That would have to be a continuous reform effort, I think, largely.
So continuing to reform that, but then you'd still have lots of people with power that would prevent that from happening all the time, as we've seen throughout history, whenever something like that has tried to come about.
Well, I mean, there's periods of relative equality and relative inequality. I think we'd agree to that, right? You would argue that 1960s was more equal across the West than the 1900s, right?
In what way?
More of the wealth was owned by the middle class.
Yes.
Okay, so it is possible to make reforms that lead to a more equal distribution of property. Okay, so we agree that it's possible. Now, all you're saying is that we need to explore different mechanisms by which to achieve that reform. Different ways to conceive of society, different ways to help society preserve capital through intergenerationally, for instance.
I guess so, yeah.
I mean, one thing I think maybe socialists might want to think about is supporting things like the family, because of all things that preserve capital, the family is one of the best ones. It's where most people get their capital from. I mean, your average middle class person gets most of their capital from their family. In many cases, the capital you get from your family will exceed your lifetime earnings. And that's not even factoring in tangible things in like education, which is also capital.
Okay. Listen, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I'm not in the best situation to debate shit like this, to be perfectly honest, because
would you like to debate?
I'm not well read.
No, it's fine. Would you like to change it? You want to talk about Antifa, right?
I don't care what to talk about. Just to be fully honest, I'm not the best person to talk about necessarily how economic structures will work in cooperatives. It's not my big interest right now. Okay.
Okay, what is your big interest? Let's go there. I apologize if I took it back.
I don't know. I'm really.
You want to talk talking about Antifa, right?
Okay, well let's talk about Antifa and see where that goes.
Yes, let's do that. So Sargon made a video criticizing your position on Antifa, which was largely positive, right?
Yes, and hyperbole as well.
Yes. Okay. So, am I right in thinking that you have a relatively positive view of Antifa?
Yes, with some criticisms. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, can you outline that? Because to me, Antifa, I come from a American West Coast city, and I mean, I think that they're doing an incredibly harmful uh, blow to public dialogue here. I mean, but you have a more positive view, right?
Yeah, I do. So the things that I suppose I would disagree with Antifa is attacking innocent people just out of the ordinary. I suppose that's just spiteful at the end of the day. I would agree, to be perfectly honest with you, that they have, in a sense, what do you call it? A I forgot what the word is. They have. I've got nothing. They have some kind of justification for why they have that anger. Yes.
Oh yeah. I think the modern world we live in is just really screwed up. I think people are dislocated. They have no spirituality that they follow. Most people don't have families anymore. It's devastating. It's devastating. You see people in American cities, and they work jobs that don't pay enough to live because the housing value is so high here. They don't have any family because, well, they come from divorced parents. Maybe one of them is dead, or if they're of lower class, one of them has substance abuse problems, and they have no community connections. All they do, they don't have any churches they go to. They don't have any bowling leagues they attend, to use the Putnam example. They only exist in the state of consumption or work, and it's totally depressing. You can see immediately why substance abuse is such a huge problem, and I wonder if that's not part of the anger that Antifa has built up.
They have a lot of anger towards yes, some of that system. How you're describing it, I don't necessarily think it's really that true. Yeah.
So I guess the question is, wouldn't the anger be better placed by building something? I guess I would.
Yeah, and most anarchists and communists are doing that in general.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, when you have a politician who's a billionaire corporatist, you would think that maybe it might also be good to sort of say that we don't agree with you being there.
Yeah, presumably they have a chance in that case, in the politician's case, to vote him out of office, right? I mean, unless it's like a federal politician, in which case your vote doesn't really count. My vote didn't count for president, certainly. But I guess if it was a local politician, you certainly would. Unless protesters have a better right to throw politicians out than regular voters do, which I think would run into some problems. So, okay. I guess, what do you think your main beef is with Sargon and his take on Antifa? Do you think he makes a misrepresentation of it?
He, I suppose, makes misinterpretation saying that they're terrorists, I suppose. Or it's some kind of terrorist gang or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, that's because of the property destruction and like the fact that people claiming to be Antifa were like macing people and punching people at Berkeley a few weeks ago at the Milo thing. I think that there were some instances of that going on in. I mean, there was recorded of Richard Spencer getting hit and stuff like that, which is a terrible idea. And to my mind, if you want to fight back against people who are nationalists and fascists, the worst thing you can possibly do is hit them.
Why?
Because fascists are way better at killing people than anarchists are.
Okay.
They will come
in
back.
A sense, I could say that liberals giving a dialogue to these people would just as easily allow them to get a better voice there.
Yeah, but in this country, you get to have a dialogue as long as you're not advocating violence. That's a guaranteed right.
Okay.
Richard Spencer hasn't advocated.
No. What I mean is people giving them a platform.
The universities have rules that allow student bodies to invite whoever they wish. Richard Spencer was invited to exactly one university in accordance with its policies, and Milo was invited to a number of universities, although Milo is not a white nationalist, I will add.
No.
Should student organizations not have the ability to invite speakers?
I don't necessarily think I don't think they should not have the ability, but I just don't think they should.
I think you should take it up with students.
I think
it's their right as students to invite whoever they wish to speak on campus. I speaking as a person.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
It's their right to invite whoever they want.
It's fine to have their right to do that, but what I'm going to say is that that's going to allow more of those things to occur. It's going to allow more. It's going to allow a better speech for those ideas to be heard.
Wouldn't they immediately be refuted because they're bad ideas?
Well,
that's the idea of the university.
That's the idea of sort of the marketplace of ideas, so to speak.
That's what the university is supposed to be, right?
That's the idea behind it. But the reality is that not everyone goes to the best ideas. That not everyone goes to the ideas that are the best things to go for.
Who would get to choose though? Who were the best ideas? I'm kind of missing that, I guess.
Ones that would improve society for the best, that would stop exploitation, I suppose.
Wouldn't Richard Spencer say that his ideas would make society the best and communist ideas?
Of course he would. Yeah.
So in the end, someone needs to decide, right?
Yeah, at the end of the day, someone needs to decide.
Yeah.
And I've lost my train of thought. At the end of the day, someone needs to come up with these ideas. I got nothing. I've lost my train of thought.
We were just talking about Antifa. I mean, I think the broad view of the left is that people like Spencer. I mean, to some extent, Spencer doesn't have very much of a platform. He has the internet. But I personally believe that it would be good if there could be more dialogue between the progressives and the alt-right. I think that would actually decrease a lot of the potential for violence in a lot of ways.
Okay, listen. Right now, I think I'm not in a good position to debate. I'll be honest with you.
Well, perhaps we can end it here. And
look,
I'll let you go.
It is partly my fault. I'll just say,
no problem.
I should have researched more about these systems. It's not my policy to talk, and I'm just not in a good position. Sorry.
No problem. Well, thank you so much for coming on and discussing your ideas. Maybe we can pick it up some other time. I really thank you for coming on. Thanks, man.
That's all right.
See you later.
Okay.
Bye.